The ground shook before Mara heard anything. She had been sitting at her work table since well past midnight, in the small back room she used for preparation work, with the candle burned low, and the smells of dried chamomile and ground black pepper thick in the air around her. The work had taken her the way it always did, fully and quietly, her hands moving through what they knew while her mind ran its own course behind them. She had been thinking about old Nell, whose joints had been stiffening badly since the first frost, and who still had not received the salt compresses Mara had been promising since the week before. She had been thinking about Clara's youngest, who had been fighting the same chest cough for 3 weeks now, and who probably needed a stronger preparation than anything Mara had tried so far. She had been thinking about willow bark and juniper berries, and the particular way the damp had gotten into her birch leaf bundles if she was not careful. These were the thoughts of her life, the ongoing list of what was needed, and what was running low, and what still needed doing, before winter came fully down from the passes and closed the roads. She was comfortable in them. She was always comfortable in this room, at this hour, with work in her hands. Then the ground moved beneath her stool, and she was not comfortable anymore. She set down the pestle. She had felt earthquakes before, the brief sideways lurch that rattled the jars and made the walls creak and left behind a faint metallic smell. This was nothing like that. This was rhythmic. This was even and deliberate, a repetition that came up through the stone floor and through the legs of the stool and into the base of her spine before it reached her ears as sound. Something was moving out in the dark, beyond the village boundary. Something very large, and moving in a formation so disciplined that its footfalls struck the earth together, in rhythm, like a single enormous pulse. She wiped her hands on her apron, crossed to the window, and looked out. Ashvale lay below her in the dark, the way it always did at this hour. Narrow packed earth roads between low stone houses, the old well catching the thinnest slice of moonlight at the square's center, the village hall with its heavy oak doors closed, the lampposts cold and unlit from the end of autumn. Every window was dark, every door was shut. 237 people, by her father's last count, sleeping inside their homes, while the mountain wind moved through the empty streets with its usual autumn cold and the smell of pine resin it always carried from the high places. But something else was in the wind tonight. She could not have named it. It was not a smell exactly, and not a sound she could have pointed to. It was more like a pressure change, the way the air felt before a storm, that was still a distance off, but already making its size known in the atmosphere. Mara had grown up in this valley. She knew every way Ashvale sounded at every hour of the night, knew the particular quality of its silence in each season, knew which sounds belonged and which didn't. The silence outside her window right now was wrong, in a way that she felt in her chest before she understood it in her mind. She reached for her shawl from the hook beside the door and went outside. The cold took her immediately. The mountain cold that had a specific character to it, carrying altitude and pine resin and the particular nameless smell from above the tree line that she had grown up knowing but had never found written in any book. She pulled the shawl around her shoulders and stood on her stone step and let her senses do what she had trained them to do, which was simply to receive and not to rush interpretation. For a moment, only the familiar sounds, the wind, the old oak at the square's eastern edge, the creek far down the valley, audible on nights this still and cold, the ordinary nighttime quiet of a place where most people were asleep. Then, building from the lowest edge of what she could hear, rising through the ground as much as through the air, she caught it. Paws on earth. Not a few, not a dozen, hundreds of them, moving in such perfect formation that she felt the rhythm of it before she fully separated the sound from the general silence of the night. She stood on her step and counted the beats between her own heartbeat and the pulse coming up through the stone beneath her feet, and they matched almost exactly. And that perfect matching told her more than any number could have about what she was hearing. She turned toward the northern road and watched them come out of the dark. She had seen wolves before, the lean gray ones that came down from the high grounds in the deepest part of winter, moving along the fence lines of the outer fields with the careful precision of animals that had learned to stay at the edges of human spaces. She had treated wolf bites from hunters who had gotten between a mother and her cubs, and she had always found the animals straightforwardly interesting rather than frightening, the way she found most things in the natural world that operated honestly within the rules of what they were. What came down the northern road was not those wolves. The smallest of them stood to the height of her shoulder. She was certain of this estimate from across the square, because she had trained herself to accurate estimation over years of professional necessity. and she trusted the skill. Their coats were dark, black and the dense gray of heavy cloud, a few of them the dark reddish-brown that looked almost black wherever the thin moonlight did not reach. Their eyes, when the light caught them, threw it back flat and cold and without warmth, the way glass threw back light, the way still water in shadow threw back light. They moved in columns, 4 across, and they moved with a discipline that was more unsettling to watch than any amount of noise or visible threat would have been. Not the movement of animals, the movement of a formed force, arriving somewhere it had already decided to arrive, executing a plan it had executed before. They poured into the village square and spread along its edges, in lines so precisely even that Mara found herself automatically estimating the spacing between animals, because estimating things was what her mind did when it needed something concrete to hold. 6 feet between them, perhaps a little more, maintained without variation, in the dark, without any visible signal passing between them. She counted until she reached 60, and then made herself stop, because 60 was a number that had already said everything it was going to say, and the columns were still moving. The lines settled. The silence that fell afterward was so complete that she could hear the candle still burning in the window above her door. Then, the last figure walked into the square. He came in alone, in human form, and the fact that he came alone was the first thing she registered, because it was the most significant thing. He did not need guards around him. The 200 wolves arranged behind him were not his protection, but his context, the way a frame was a painting's context. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, dressed in a long cloak that moved with him in the wind, with the ease of something worn so many times it had settled into the shape of the person wearing it. His face, in the thin moonlight, was the kind that had been built for function rather than expression, precise lines. Nothing decorative about it. The face of someone who had long since arrived at themselves and stopped making adjustments. He was younger than she had expected. She had not known she was expecting anything until the expectation was wrong. He was somewhere in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at the outside. He walked into the center of the square with a steadiness that had nothing to do with performance or display. He simply walked the way he walked, which was without hesitation, and without any apparent awareness that hesitation was a thing that could exist. He looked around the square. His eyes moved in a slow, methodical arc from the hall to the well, to the oak tree, to the houses arranged around the perimeter. And the movement of his eyes was the movement of accounting, not searching. He already knew what he expected to find. He was confirming. His eyes came around to her doorstep and stopped. She was the only person standing anywhere in the visible world. Every other door in the square was closed, and every other window was dark, because every other person was either sleeping through the arrival, possible, given that the footfalls had come up through the ground rather than through the air, and some people slept deeply, or had woken up and made the sensible choice to stay behind closed doors. Mara had come outside because she had never in her life been able to stay still when she did not know what was happening, and she had not changed this about herself, and had no plans to. He looked at her for several seconds, not in the way that someone looked at a threat, and not in the way that someone looked at something they intended to harm, more the way a careful person looked at a detail that did not fit the pattern they had expected to find. She was the only thing in this square that was not where it was supposed to be at this hour. He was noting this. His expression did not change. She did not look away. She did not move. There was nothing useful to be gained from either of those things, and she had no interest in doing things that weren't useful. Then his eyes moved on. He said something brief and low to the wolf standing nearest him, and turned toward the village hall, and crossed to it with the same unhurried stride, and went inside. Mara stood on her step for another minute. She was breathing deliberately, the way she breathed when she was working through something that required steadiness rather than speed. When she was certain her legs were going to hold her weight without difficulty, she went inside, sat at the kitchen table in the dark with her hands flat on the wood in front of her, and waited for morning. She did not sleep. There was nothing left in the night that resembled the conditions for sleep. She sat at the table and listened to the sounds of the village change around her, the sounds she had known all her life, joined by sounds she had never heard here before. Low voices at the edges of the square, the movement of the wolf patrol past her window at regular intervals, the systematic and unhurried sounds of a large force making itself at home. These sounds did not stop. She listened to them until the sky outside began to lighten at its edges, and then she got up and put the kettle on, because there was nothing to be done with the night, but the morning was going to require her to be functional. Her father came at first light. She heard his knock before the water had boiled, the 3 even taps he had been using on her door since she was small. She crossed the kitchen and let him in, and she saw, in the gray morning light, what the night had done to his face. Owen Voss was 61 years old and had been the village elder of Ashvale for 15 years, and in those 15 years, he had handled the flooding of the lower fields, the drought that had followed the summer she turned 20, and the sickness that had moved through the village when she was in her late teens, and taken 23 people before she and her books and her stubborn hours in the cellar had found the preparation that finally slowed it. He had handled all of those things with the steadiness that she had always quietly relied on. This morning he looked older than she had ever seen him look, not broken, but pressed against something that had no good side. He sat at the table and told her what he knew. He told her about the Black Fang Pack, whose name she had been hearing for the past year or so, in the way you heard about large weather systems, while they were still distant, present in the news, and not yet present in the way things in your own square were present. He told her about Kalen Drav, 29 years old, Alpha King, 4 years of territorial expansion behind him, and 11 territories under his control. He did not destroy the settlements he took. He integrated them. This was the important thing, her father said, with the careful emphasis of a man reminding himself of what he needed to hold on to. He integrates, Owen said. The people stay in his territories, Mara. They live under his rule. It is not what we would choose. But they stay. What brought him here? She asked. The valley. Owen wrapped both hands around the cup she had put in front of him. There is an underground water supply below the south field, significant. I did not know about it. 3 other packs have known about it for some time. He paused. He arrived first. Mara sat with this for a moment. She had spent her entire life on this land, and had never known there was something beneath it that someone powerful enough to come and take it would want. The valley was her home. She had never thought of it as a resource. She had never needed to, because the people here had simply lived in it and on it, and the idea that someone might look at the same ground and see something to acquire had not been a thought she had needed to have before now. What happens to us? She asked. She was not asking whether they were safe. She understood the answer to that was complex and contingent, and not available yet. She was asking what came next. A feast, he said. A submission feast. The village prepares food for the pack. The territory is formally integrated. It is meant to be. He stopped briefly. It is traditional. It signals peaceful terms. Mara made tea. She moved through the kitchen doing the small ordinary things that kept her hands busy when her mind was running harder than she wanted it to. She set bread and cheese and the last of the autumn apples on the table. Lena appeared in the doorway, looking as if she had slept for perhaps 1 hour, and had spent the rest of the night pressed against the wall listening to the sounds of the square below, which was probably accurate. She was 16, and she had never in her life encountered anything more frightening than a bad harvest or a bad winter. "Come in," Mara said. "Sit down." Lena came in and sat, and they ate together, the 3 of them, in a silence that was not comfortable, but was at least shared, which was better than being afraid alone. When her father left to go back to the hall and meet with the pack's representatives, when Lena retreated to the front room with the mending she used when she needed her hands to do something, Mara sat alone at the kitchen table for a few minutes, looking at the trapdoor in the floor. Then she got up, opened it, took the lamp from its hook, and went down. The herb cellar was cool and dim, the overlapping smells of 100 different plants filling the low space with something that was entirely particular to this room. She had built this space over years. Her mother had taught her here, in the time before the sickness, and after her mother was gone, Mara had continued alone, with books and practice and the particular stubbornness that had always been the thing about her she could least change. Every jar on every shelf was in its place for a reason she could explain. Every bundle hanging from the ceiling beams had been gathered by her own hands. This room was the most ordered place in her life, and always had been. She moved to the back corner of the cellar, to the wooden box with the iron clasp that sat by itself on a shelf she had cleared specifically for it. She had put it there years ago because the contents were different in kind from everything else she kept. Not more or less important, different. She opened the box. The wolfsbane inside was dried and tied in a small dark cloth bundle. She had gathered it from the rocky ground above the upper pass 3 or 4 years ago, where it grew in the shade of the old stones at the height where almost nothing else grew. She had dried it carefully and stored it here, with the same care she gave everything. Because she was a herbalist, and dangerous knowledge was still knowledge, and a healer, who refused to know the most dangerous things, was a healer who was always one emergency away from being useless. She had never needed it. She had never thought she would. She stood looking at it for a long time without touching it. Through the stone ceiling above her she could hear the occupied village going about its first morning, under new authority. Footsteps on the square, low voices in a register that wasn't hers. The sound of something organized and deliberate. The sound of a force that had done this before, and knew exactly what it was doing now. She closed the box. She did not touch the bundle. She went back upstairs. By noon the notice had appeared on the board at the well. She read it with a cluster of neighbors who had come out into the cold to read it as well, all of them standing close together without speaking, because proximity was something, and silence was sometimes the only honest response. The feast. The requirements, the list of preparations expected from the village. Her name at the bottom of the list. The village elder's daughter, the most experienced herbalist and cook in Ashvale, appointed head cook for the submission feast. She read it twice, then she walked home. She went directly to the trapdoor, went down to the cellar, opened the locked box, and stood in front of it for a long time. She got out the mortar and pestle from the shelf where they lived, and set them on the table beside the box. She did not use them yet. She was not ready yet. She sat down on the low stool in the corner, and she did the thing she always did before a serious decision, which was to be completely honest with herself about what she was considering, not to soften it or frame it more kindly than it deserved, but to look at it directly and clearly, and from every angle she could find. The fear that came with looking at it directly, she let be present as information rather than fighting it, because fear that was accurate was worth having. The costs on each side of the decision, she added up as honestly as she could, because she was not going to choose anything she hadn't truly looked at. The wolfsbane sat in its bundle, 10 inches from her fingers, inside the open box. When Lena called from the kitchen above that she was starting the evening fire, Mara set the mortar and pestle back on their shelf. She closed the box. She left it unlocked. She climbed the stairs and went to help with the fire, and did not look at the trapdoor again that evening. But in the back of her mind, in the careful space where she kept the decisions she had not finished making, the box sat open, and she knew, with the particular certainty of someone who has already traveled most of the distance toward a decision without fully admitting it, that she would come back. She always came back to unfinished things. It was the most consistent thing about her. 2 days before the feast, the village had taken on a particular quality that Mara recognized as fear, wearing the costume of ordinary life. People still kept to their routines. She saw this everywhere she looked, and she found it both admirable and entirely predictable, because people who had spent their lives in a place knew, at some deep and wordless level, that the place went on regardless, that the rhythm of ordinary days was the only container available for extraordinary ones. Nell was at her window each morning, with her cup of hot water and the dried fruit she had eaten at that hour for 30 years, since her teeth had gone bad enough to make solid food in the morning more trouble than it was worth. Finn still took his dogs out for their walk, though he had adjusted the route away from the square, which told Mara that Finn's common sense was sharper than his pride. The schoolhouse was open. The children walked to it in groups that were slightly closer together than usual, their voices slightly lower than they normally were, but they went. The bread stall opened. The dairy wagon made its deliveries. The surface of ordinary life held. The pack was present but not aggressive. She had noted this carefully in those first 2 days, watching from windows and from doorways, and from the square when she crossed it on her errands, reading what she saw with the same attention she brought to any situation she was trying to understand before she acted in it. The wolves who moved through the village did so with the air of people using a space for practical purposes. They walked through the streets. They stood watch at the hall entrance in pairs. They spoke to each other in their own language, and did not address villagers unless there was a specific practical reason to. They were not cruel. They were not warm. They were simply and completely present, in the way that severe weather was simply and completely present, and there was no more point in resenting them than in resenting rain. She caught sight of Kalen Drav twice in those 2 days. The first time was early morning, when she was at the well pulling the day's water. He was crossing the far side of the square with Dorian, who she had already identified as the pack's senior administrator, and another wolf she didn't know yet. He was speaking, not quickly, but with the focused brevity of someone working through decisions, rather than making conversation, and he did not look toward the well. She gave herself 8 seconds of observation, long enough to note his movement, the set of his shoulders, the quality of his attention on whatever Dorian was telling him, the complete absence of anything that looked like uncertainty, and then she looked back at the bucket, because staring was a habit she had always associated with people who didn't have enough to do, and she had more than enough. The second time was the afternoon before the feast, and it was different. Sarah, the Alpha King's second-in-command, had sent word that the feast requirements needed to be formally reviewed. Mara arrived at the village hall at the time specified, and was shown to the side room where Sarah was waiting, with a written list and an expression that suggested she had already formed her opinion of this meeting, and was simply going through the steps of having it. Sarah was perhaps 35, dark-haired, the particular kind of self-contained that came not from coldness, but from having been in many difficult rooms, and having learned what was worth showing and what wasn't. She went through the requirements list without preamble, which Mara appreciated. 40 senior pack members and the Alpha King. The Alpha King sat alone at the head of the table, custom, and the spacing on either side of his place needed to reflect this clearly. Bread and centerpiece dishes on the main table, supporting dishes on the serving boards along the walls. The serving paths were to be kept clear of open flame, because some of the older wolves had a sensitivity to it. Serving was to move from the back of the hall forward, not the other way. He tastes first, Sarah said, at the bottom of the list, in the same measured tone she had used for every other item. Mara looked up from the paper. Can you say that again? The Alpha King tastes the main dishes before the meal is formally served to the rest of the hall. Sarah did not adjust her tone. He has done this since the first integration 4 years ago. It is protocol. Mara considered this. He does it to demonstrate to his own wolves that the food is safe. It wasn't a question. Among other reasons, Sarah said. Is anything on the requirements list outside your capacity? No, Mara said, because in the literal sense of the question, nothing was. She was still standing in the doorway, reviewing the paper a few minutes later, going over the details a second time out of professional habit, when the side door of the room opened, and Kalen came through it. He was carrying a folded document, reading it as he walked, and he had covered half the room before he registered her presence. He stopped. The recognition moved across his face, brief and specific. This was the woman from the doorstep, the only person who had been standing outside when the pack arrived, and it settled into something neutral and focused. He looked at her for perhaps 3 seconds. She looked back. Then he nodded once, the small, precise nod of someone acknowledging a fact, turned, and went out through the main door. Mara stood in the doorway for a moment after the door closed. Then she folded the requirements list, put it in her apron pocket, and walked home. She sent Lena to bed early that night, which Lena accepted with the particular understanding of someone who could read a room well enough to know when she wasn't needed in it. When the house was quiet and the fire had burned to its evening level, Mara took the lamp and went to the cellar. She had spent the previous day and most of the previous night reviewing what she knew. She had the reference materials, 2 books she had acquired years ago from a traveling merchant who had not known what he was selling, both of them covering medicinal plant interactions with shifter biology in more detail than anything else she had access to. She had read the relevant sections many times now. She knew the specific class of alkaloids in wolfsbane that produced the physiological effects she was calculating for, the nausea and disorientation, and significant physical weakness that set in within 2 to 3 hours of ingestion in an average-weight wolf shifter. She knew the dosing ranges described in the literature. She had done the arithmetic carefully, working through the numbers with the same methodical precision she used for any serious preparation, and she had been conservative in her estimates because she was not trying to produce the worst possible outcome. She was trying to produce a specific and limited one. She was not trying to kill anyone. She had examined this from every angle she could find, repeatedly, and she was certain of it. She wanted disorder. She wanted enough simultaneous distress in enough of the senior pack members in the hall to produce the kind of confusion that would give the village a window. People disappearing into the forest margins, into the mountain paths that she had been quietly noting the locations of since the morning the notice went up. Not everyone would make it far. She had calculated for this too, looked at it without flinching, because looking away from the real costs of a real decision was how you ended up making decisions you hadn't actually agreed to. Some people would not reach safety. Some, in the passes in the cold of this time of year, might not make it at all. She weighed this against the third pack, the one her father had named on the first morning, the one Kalen had described without describing, the one that did not maintain civilian populations it had taken from territory it intended to use. She sat in the cellar and waited. Then she opened the box, took out the wolfsbane, untied the bundle on the table, and got out her mortar and pestle. She had planned the masking agents carefully, cloves and black pepper, both of which produce strong aromatic compounds in baking, and both of which would work naturally in a savory loaf, without raising suspicion from anyone reading the smell of the bread. She had worked out the proportions she needed to change the scent profile significantly enough that she was reasonably confident even the sharper olfactory sense of a wolf shifter would read bread and herbs, not anything more specific. She had thought about the heat. She knew that some alkaloids were sensitive to temperature, that baking could change the properties of compounds in ways that needed to be accounted for. She had flagged this in her thinking as something to verify precisely, something she needed to confirm with specific numbers before she proceeded. She told herself she would look it up and confirm the numbers before she mixed anything. She picked up the pestle and began to grind. The sound filled the cellar. Steady, even, the rhythm she used for every significant preparation. Her hands knew the motion. Her mind was running behind them on the numbers, on the dosing, on the marking she would use to identify the loaf once it was baked, on the placement of the loaf in the bread basket, on the sequence of events at the feast. She was constructing the plan the way she constructed any complex preparation, holding all of it at once, checking each piece against the others. The alkaloid heat degradation. She told herself she would check it. She told herself this several more times as she worked through the grinding, each time intending to set the pestle down and go to the shelf where the reference books lived, each time not doing it, because the grinding had a momentum to it, and the momentum was carrying her, and she was almost done, and she would look it up after she finished. She would look it up after. She worked for most of the night. When she sealed the powder into a small labeled jar and set it on the shelf in the space she had cleared for it, the specific detail she had meant to check was still unchecked. She was aware of this. She told herself she would check it in the morning, before she baked anything. She climbed back upstairs, lay down on her bed fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling until the sky began to lighten. She did not get up to check the reference books. She got up instead and lit the fire, because the morning was here, and the feast was in 2 days, and there were still preparations to make beyond the bread, things she needed to gather and measure and organize, and the heat degradation question was a number she would look at before she used the mortar. She would definitely look at it before she used what she had ground. She told herself this clearly. She believed it, at the time. She was tired and afraid, and more certain than she had any right to be, and these three things together had produced the kind of resolve that was indistinguishable from wisdom until it was too late to tell them apart. She made tea. She started the day. By the time she went to bed that night, the jar was still on the shelf in the cellar, sealed. The exact heat threshold she had meant to verify, still unchecked in the reference books, and she had stopped telling herself she would look at it, and started telling herself it didn't matter, which was a different thing, and a worse one. She started the bread before the village was awake. This was deliberate. She needed the kitchen to herself, and the kitchen was reliably hers only in the early hours, before Lena came down with her careful attempts at usefulness, and before the 3 women she had arranged to help with the rest of the feast preparations would arrive at midday. She lit the fire while the square outside was still dark, watched it build to the temperature she needed, and stood for a moment, in the warming kitchen, with her hands at her sides. 12 loaves. The requirements list called for bread sufficient for 40 wolves, and the Alpha King, and wolf shifters ate substantially more than ordinary human quantities. She had accounted for this in her planning, and she had also accounted for the reality that she wanted the bread baskets full, wanted them overflowing slightly, wanted there to be plenty of loaves to reach past, plenty of choices for a hand that was not looking for anything specific. She started with the starter, the living culture she had maintained for 3 years, and fed every morning with the same regularity she gave to everything in her care that required ongoing attention. She mixed the dough in the large bowl, felt it begin to come together under her hands, and gave herself to the work, the way she always did, that particular absorption that made bread the thing she turned to when she needed to be entirely present to something physical. 11 of the 12 loaves she made exactly as she always made bread. She knew every stage of the process by feel, by smell, by the particular resistance of the dough under her palms at each step of development. Rosemary, crushed between her fingers and distributed through the dough evenly. Sea salt. The long initial mixing that gave the crumb its character. She made them well, because she made everything well, and because some part of her that she did not examine directly, and some part that was operating below the level of the decisions she was consciously making, felt that the quality of the bread she served at this feast mattered, as if making good bread were a form of honesty, in a situation where almost nothing else was going to be fully honest. The 12th loaf she handled differently. The small labeled jar was in her apron pocket. She had put it there the night before, so that she would not have to go to the cellar to retrieve it during the baking, because going to the cellar and coming back up was the kind of interruption to momentum that could let the wrong thoughts in. She was not going to let the wrong thoughts in now. She had already had every thought that was available to have. She had had them for 2 days. She was done thinking. She portioned the dough for the 12th loaf and set it in front of her. She took the jar from her pocket. She held it for a moment, her hands steady, the morning light beginning at the kitchen window, pale and clear, the specific light of a cloudless autumn day above the mountains. Her hands did not shake. She had checked this before she began, and they did not shake now. She opened the jar. She worked the powder into the dough with the same steady hands she had used on the other 11, distributing it carefully, not concentrated in one place but spread throughout the loaf so that the baking would carry it evenly. She added the cloves, the black pepper, more of each than any of the other loaves had, and she mixed them in until the dough smelled like what she wanted it to smell like, which was bread with a particularly strong savory herb note, a bread that a nose searching for anything unusual would pass over as simply a well-seasoned loaf. She shaped the loaf. She put the jar back in her pocket. Before she set it to prove with the others, she turned it upside down on the table and took the blunt tip of a wooden skewer and pressed 4 shallow lines into the base of the dough, 2 crossing 2, a small crosshatch that sat perhaps half a centimeter deep. She pressed firmly enough that it would survive the proving and hold through the baking and be visible to someone looking for it. She turned the loaf right side up. She placed it 6th from the left in the proving row. She stepped back and looked at the 12 loaves arranged on the shelf, all of them sitting in their identical raw shapes, all of them looking exactly the same from the front, from the sides, from any angle at which another person in this kitchen would be standing. She put the flour away, washed the powder residue off her hands thoroughly, dried them, and turned to the other preparations that still needed attention before the feast. There were vegetables to prepare, and simmer stocks to begin. There were serving dishes to check for cleanliness and spice levels to confirm, and the list of other preparations the requirements document had specified. She worked through these tasks with the focused competence that was her natural mode, moving efficiently through the kitchen, doing the things that needed doing. Lena arrived while the bread was still in its first prove. She came down with her hair pinned back and her sleeves already rolled, which meant she had been awake for some time deciding to be helpful, and had come down prepared. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, taking in her sister at the counter and the row of proving loaves on the shelf, and she said, without preamble, "You didn't sleep." "Some," Mara said. "You've been down here since before the dark went. There's a great deal to do." Lena crossed to the table and sat down. She looked at Mara for a long moment, and Mara kept her hands moving through the vegetable preparation, kept her eyes on what she was doing, kept her breathing even, and her surface exactly as it needed to be. "Mara," Lena said, "what are you going to do?" The kitchen held them both in its morning warmth. The fire, the smell of yeast and rosemary from the proving loaves, the pale autumn light at the window, 12 loaves in a row on the shelf, the 6th, from the left, indistinguishable from its neighbors by sight. "I'm going to make this village the best meal it has ever prepared," Mara said, "and serve it properly, and then we will see what happens." That is not an answer. It is the honest one. Mara looked at her sister directly for a moment. "Help me with the carrots." Lena picked up a knife and went to work on the carrots, and she did not ask again, and Mara did not offer more, and they worked together through the rest of the morning, in the particular silence of 2 people who knew each other well enough to know when there was nothing more useful to say. Clara arrived at midday, compact and quick-handed, with the expressionless efficiency of a person who had done difficult things in difficult circumstances before, and had no particular opinion about whether this situation was harder than others. Betts came half an hour later, quieter than usual but steady, her hands already carrying the particular competence they always carried when there was real work to do. The kitchen became 4 people working toward a deadline, the organized noise of preparations proceeding on parallel tracks. Mara directed where direction was needed and moved out of the way where it wasn't, keeping the overall picture in her attention, while her hands stayed busy with the tasks in front of her. The morning passed the way cooking mornings passed, faster than you thought, and with always one more thing still to do. The bread went into the oven in 2 batches. Mara stood at the oven through both of them, checking the heat with her palm above the door the way she always did, rotating the loaves at the halfway point, reading the color of the crust and the smell coming from inside with the accuracy of someone who had baked enough bread that the signs of done and not quite done were as clear to her as words. When the first batch came out, she transferred the loaves to the cooling rack one by one. When the second batch came out, she did the same, working from the right side of the baking tray to the left, setting each loaf down carefully. When she reached the 6th from the left, she picked it up and turned it over. The crosshatch was there, 4 lines, baked into the crust, subtle, sitting in the pale gold of the underside's crust in a way that looked almost like a crease from the proving cloth if you were not looking for it specifically. She turned it right side up and set it on the cooling rack with the others. Clara came up beside her and looked at the row of 12 loaves, golden and perfectly risen, filling the kitchen with the smell of rosemary and salt and the good hot smell of fresh bread. "Those are beautiful," she said, with the simple approval of someone who knew what good bread looked like and did not qualify the compliment. "Thank you," Mara said. She loaded the bread baskets in the late afternoon, alone, while Clara and Bets were managing the dishes that needed to leave for the hall. She placed the loaves one by one into the baskets, distributing them so that the central basket, the one that would go on the main table closest to the head, held the marked loaf in the middle of the pile, not at the top where it would be the first loaf reached without thought, not at the bottom where it would be the last, in the middle, where a hand reaching naturally into a full basket would land on it, with ordinary probability, or a hand looking for a specific loaf would find it with very little effort. She covered the basket. She set it among the others. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, with the baskets around her, the fire burning, the smell of everything she had spent the day making filling the room, and she thought about what she was about to carry across the square, and what she had decided, and whether she was ready to go. She was not sure, in the way she was never sure of things that mattered and could not be undone. She was sure in the other way, the way she was sure of decisions that had already been made honestly and completely, where going back over the ground again would produce nothing new. She picked up the central basket. She put her coat on. Outside, the cold of the early evening was sharp and specific, the mountain cold with all its components, and the village hall was lit from within, the windows warm with the light of the hearths inside. She walked toward it across the square, putting one foot in front of the other, with the care and steadiness of someone who had decided that steadiness was the thing she needed, and was choosing it deliberately. She had made bread. She had marked one loaf. She was carrying it across the square to the feast. She was not going to think beyond that right now. She pushed through the hall's side entrance and got to work. The hall had been transformed in ways that had nothing to do with its furnishings. Mara had been in this room for all of the significant communal events of her life, the monthly dinners, the seasonal festivals, the difficult community meetings, the quiet gatherings that followed deaths. She knew the sound this space made when it was full of people, knew the way the 2 hearths at either end threw light that was warm but uneven, knew which floorboards gave slightly and which were solid, knew the acoustics at the north end that could carry a whisper to the far wall if the timing and direction were right. She had been in this hall for things that were hard and things that were good and everything in between, and she had always known, when she walked through its main doors, what she was walking into. She did not know what she was walking into now. She came in through the kitchen side entrance, which gave her a few seconds to take in the room from the back before anyone had reason to look at her. The hall was nearly full. The pack's senior wolves sat at the long tables that now occupied the center of the floor, more of them than the requirements document had specified, closer to 60 than 40 by her count, though she made herself stop counting after the first few seconds because the number was not the point. They were in human form, all of them, dressed with the functional plainness of people who had no interest in display. They were speaking to each other in their own language and in hers, the 2 registers mixing in the warm air of the hall, and the overall sound was the sound of a large gathering that was entirely comfortable in its own context, that had no question about its right to be where it was. She put the bread baskets down at the kitchen station and picked up the serving tray and got to work. She had served food in this hall since she was old enough to carry a dish without dropping it, and she brought all of that years-long practice to bear now, moving through the room with the ease of someone who knew the space, even though the space had become something different. She placed dishes on the serving boards along the walls. She carried the water pitchers and set them on the tables. She carried the bread baskets last, distributing them along the main table, placing the central one, the one with the marked loaf in the middle of the pile, in the position closest to the head of the table. She did all of this without lingering anywhere, without allowing herself to stand still long enough to feel the full weight of what she was doing in this room, in this context, with the thing she had put in one of those baskets. Moving was better. Moving kept the surface intact. Moving was something she knew how to do. She was at the far end of the hall, adjusting plates at the outermost table, when the hall changed. She felt it before she saw it, the way she had felt the wolves arriving on the night of their coming, as a pressure change rather than a sound. A collective shift in the quality of the room's energy, subtle and simultaneous, the way a group of people shifted when they had all oriented to the same thing without anyone having said to. She looked up. He was crossing the hall from the main doors. He moved the way he always moved, with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never in his life needed to wonder about his right to move through any space in any way he chose. The hall around him continued in its noise and conversation, but it had shifted its orientation, not dramatically, not in any way he appeared to notice or require, but she felt it clearly. The room knew where he was. He reached the head of the table, and Dorian appeared at his elbow with a document that required a brief decision, and he handled it in 2 sentences without sitting down, and then sat, and the hall moved into the beginning of the meal. Mara served. She had a method for hard moments. She had developed it over years of working through situations that required her to be useful, while also being afraid, or grieving, or running on too little sleep. The method was simple. Choose something immediate and concrete, something within reach and within her control, and attend to it completely. Let the attending carry her through the moments that would otherwise have been too heavy to move through standing up. She chose the water pitchers. She chose the level of food on the serving boards. She chose Clara's position in the hall, and Bets's position near the kitchen entrance, and the specific logistical details of what was running low, and what needed bringing out. She moved from one to the next without pause, not because she was afraid to pause, but because pausing was not what this moment called for. She did not look directly at the head of the table. She did not look directly at the bread baskets. She looked at what she was doing, and she did it, and she let the hall be what it was around her. The meal began to move in the way that large communal meals moved, a little slowly at first as people settled, then with a gathering momentum as food was passed, and conversation opened up, and the particular ease of a group at table asserted itself. The bread baskets were passed along the tables, hands reaching in and taking loaves without ceremony, the ordinary automatic actions of people eating. She watched this from the edges of her vision, saw each basket make its way along each table, saw the loaves disappear one by one into the hands of the people seated there. The central basket, on the main table nearest the head, was passed from person to person, a loaf taken here, a loaf taken there. The pile in the basket decreased. She watched the marked loaf remain in the middle, neither the first choice nor the last, sitting among the others. Then the wolf, seated 2 places to the left of the head of the table, lifted the basket and offered it toward the right. Mara was at the far end of the hall. She was holding a water pitcher. She was walking toward the outermost table. She did not stop walking. She made herself not stop walking. She reached the table, set the pitcher down, picked up the empty one. She turned to take it back to the water station. She looked at the head of the table. Kalen's hand was in the bread basket. She watched his fingers move through the loaves. It was a deliberate movement, not the automatic reach of a person taking the nearest available thing. His fingers moved over the top loaf, which was the easiest one to take, and past it, and through the ones beneath, with the particular unhurriedness of someone who was looking for something, or who had not yet decided which loaf they wanted, and was not inclined to rush the decision. His fingers settled on the loaf in the middle of the pile. The breath left Mara's body. She stood with the water pitcher in her hands, and watched him lift the loaf. He held it for a moment, and even from 30 feet away she could see in the quality of his stillness that he had turned it over. that he was looking at the base of the loaf, that whatever he was seeing there had arrested his motion for a fraction of a second. Then he turned it right side up. He looked up. His eyes crossed the hall directly to where she was standing, with the directness of someone who had not been searching and did not need to, who had already known, with the precision that apparently characterized everything he did, where she was and what she was doing. She could not have moved in that moment even if she had wanted to. She stood with the pitcher in her hands and she looked back at him across the length of the hall, and the feast went on around them, and nobody near him appeared to notice anything, and the distance between them was 30 feet, and contained everything that had happened in the past 4 days, and everything that was about to happen. He looked at her for a length of time that was several seconds, and felt considerably longer. She did not look away. There was no point in looking away. There was nothing she could communicate by looking away that was more useful than what she was communicating by not looking away, which was that she was here, and she had made a decision, and she was not going to pretend she hadn't. Then he broke the bread. He tore it with both hands, the way you tore bread when you intended to eat it, not theatrically, not performatively, just the ordinary act of tearing a piece to eat. He put the first piece in his mouth. He chewed. He swallowed. He turned to the wolf on his left and said something, and the wolf nodded and responded, and the conversation at the head of the table moved forward, and the feast continued exactly as it had been. Mara set the water pitcher down on the edge of the nearest table because she could no longer trust her hands to hold it. She gripped the table with one hand, just for a moment, 4 seconds, 5. She felt the solid wood under her palm. She breathed. Then she picked up the pitcher, took it back to the water station, and refilled it, and went back to the tables, and kept working. She served for another 3 hours. She served for 3 more hours. She moved through them with the particular focused composure she had developed over years of working in circumstances that required her to be useful regardless of how she felt. Grief, exhaustion, fear, she had worked through all of these, and she had learned that the working was not the opposite of feeling but a form of it, a way of channeling what was happening inside into something that still did good. She chose each immediate task and attended to it completely. The water pitchers, the serving boards, Clara's progress through the hall, Bet's at the kitchen end. She kept track of what was running low and what needed bringing out, and the specific sequence of things that a large meal required. She kept track of all of this, and she kept moving through the hall, and she did not let herself look at the head of the table any more than a single confirming glance every 30 minutes required. He was fine. She could see this from across the hall, without needing to look directly. He was eating. He was speaking with the wolves on either side of him. His posture had not changed. His face had not changed. He was entirely, simply, composedly fine. She understood what this meant. She had been understanding it since the moment she set down the water pitcher and gripped the table edge. The specific understanding that came when your body recognized something your mind had been refusing to fully examine. The heat, the baking temperature. She had not checked the specific degradation range for this class of alkaloids before she put them in the bread. She had told herself she would check, and she had not checked, and what she was looking at now, from 30 feet away, was the consequence of not checking. The bread was bread. The powder she had ground so carefully, measured so precisely, distributed so evenly, had gone into an oven at a temperature sufficient to reduce it to nothing useful. The loaf he had eaten from had been exactly what it looked like, exactly what all 12 loaves looked like, bread. She attended to the water pitchers. She attended to the serving boards. She moved through the remaining hours of the feast in the particular way she moved through things that were too large to hold and too important to drop, which was one moment at a time, fully present to the moment in front of her, not permitting herself to run ahead. The feast wound down the way large meals did, gradually and without announcement, conversations shortening and plates emptying, and people beginning to push back from tables with the particular satisfied ease of people whose evening had gone as expected. The wolves departed in groups, moving out through the main doors or the side exit, their conversations continuing into the square outside. The head table cleared last. Kalen rose from his seat and left through the hall's side exit with a group of 8 or 9, his cloak already on, his step the same even stride as always. He did not look toward the serving area as he left. He did not look at her. She noted this. She did not know yet what it meant. She helped Clara and Betts clear the tables and carry everything back to the kitchen. They worked in the way they always worked together, efficiently, and without needing to narrate what they were doing, and Clara put her hand on Mara's arm briefly, as they passed each other near the far hearth, and did not say anything, which was exactly right. Bet scraped plates with the absorption of someone who processed difficult things through the completion of concrete tasks, which Mara understood and respected. They were done within the hour. Mara walked home across the dark square. The cold had sharpened while she was inside, the mountain cold with all its weight, and she walked through it with her shawl pulled tight and her eyes on the ground in front of her, not because she was avoiding anything she might see, but because she was doing the specific mental work of not running ahead of herself. She went inside. She shut the door. She sat at her kitchen table in the dark, with the fire burned down, and the room cooler than it should be, and she set her palms flat on the wood surface in front of her and stopped. The fear that had been running beneath the surface of the past 4 hours came up all at once. She had known it was there, had been managing it the way she managed things during difficult work, contained and useful, and set aside for later. Later was now. She sat with it, and breathed, and let it be fully present. Because fear that she looked at honestly was information, and she needed information. He was fine. She had watched him for 4 hours across the length of the hall, and he was completely fine. He had eaten the bread, and he had continued eating and speaking and moving through the evening exactly as he had begun it. She ran through the chemistry again, not because she hadn't run through it already, but because precision mattered, and she wanted to arrive at the same answer twice. The alkaloids she had ground into that powder, the class they belonged to, the temperature at which they began to degrade. She had read this, she knew she had read this, in one of the 2 reference books she had acquired years ago. She had read it, and had made a mental note to check the specific numbers before she baked anything, and she had not done that. She had not done it because she had not wanted to do it, because checking the number might have told her something that would have interrupted the conviction she had been carrying, and conviction had felt, at the time, more important than accuracy. The baking temperature for rosemary bread. She knew her own oven. She knew the number. She had always known the number. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark and felt the specific, sharp quality of understanding something too late that you had known and chosen not to look at directly. It was different from ignorance. It had a particular texture to it, that specific kind of error, the kind where the information had been available and you had moved past it because you were afraid of what it would say. The bread was bread. It had been bread from the moment it came out of the oven. Everything she had done in the cellar, the grinding and the measuring and the 2 nights of calculation, had gone into 12 ordinary loaves, because she had not confirmed the thing she needed to confirm. She sat in the dark for a long time. She did not know yet what he was going to do with what he knew. She had seen him see the mark. She had watched his hand move through the basket with intention, had watched him turn the loaf over, had watched the brief arrest of his motion when he found what he was looking at. She had watched him eat the bread while looking at her across the hall. She had watched him leave the hall an hour ago without looking in her direction. The possibilities branched from here in ways she could not fully map, because she did not have enough information about who he was and what he did with what he knew. She had observations. She had 4 days of watching him move through her village with a calm that gave nothing away. She had the fact of the bread, eaten, and herself standing here, unharmed, as far as she currently was. She was still sitting at the table when someone knocked on her door. She had been expecting it. She understood, sitting there in the dark with her palms flat on the table, and her thoughts running their quiet course, that she had been expecting a knock since the moment she had watched his eyes find hers across the hall. The only question had been when. She stood. She straightened her apron by reflex. She walked to the door and opened it. The young wolf outside had the formal posture of someone delivering a message he had been told was important, and who was aware that the delivery was part of the message. He said the Alpha King requested her presence. He said it in the careful, neutral way of someone who had been told to say those words and not others, which told her those had been the exact instructions. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Give me a moment," went back inside, took her shawl from the hook, and came back out. They walked together across the square. The night was very cold, the square empty of everyone, except the watchwolves at the hall entrance, who did not look at her as she passed. The inn's main entrance was lit from inside. She went through it and into the ground floor, which was quiet now, and down the back corridor to the room at the end. The wolf knocked twice. A low voice from inside said to come in. He opened the door and stepped back. Mara walked through. The room was plainly furnished: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf, a lamp. Kalen was seated at the table with a ceramic cup held in one hand, and his posture entirely unchanged from how it had looked across the hall all evening, upright and quiet and completely present. The document that had been in front of him was closed and set aside. He was looking at her when she came in. She crossed the room and sat in the chair across the table from him. He was fine. She had known it from the hall, had understood it intellectually while she was still managing the serving, but sitting 2 feet from him now, she felt the full reality of it settle. He was completely, simply, ordinarily fine. Not recovering, not managing anything. Fine. The same man who had walked into her village square 4 days ago, as though it were a space he had always intended to occupy. She folded her hands in her lap and met his eyes and waited. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Were you trying to kill us, or were you trying to save your people?" The question came without heat, without accusation, without anything in it except a genuine desire for accurate information. It was the kind of question she asked in her professional life, when she needed to understand what had actually happened, before she could decide what to do next. She told him the truth. She had decided this somewhere between the moment he looked at her across the hall and the moment she sat down in this chair, and the decision was solid. "Save my people," she said. The dosage was calculated for incapacitation, not lethality. "I wanted enough distress, in enough of your senior wolves, simultaneously, to give the village a window, to disappear into the mountain paths." He nodded slowly, the same small precise nod she had seen him use when receiving information that confirmed what he already suspected. "And the heat," he said. She held his gaze. "I knew the alkaloids were heat-sensitive. I told myself I would check the specific degradation threshold before I baked the bread. I did not check it." He looked at her for a moment. "The compounds you ground degrade above 190 degrees, he said. "You bake the bread at approximately 230. "I know that now," she said. "You should have known it before." "Yes," she said. "I should have." The lamp on the shelf between them threw a small, warm, steady light. Through the window above the bed, she could see the edge of the square, the dark shapes of the houses across it. "You marked the loaf," he said. "Yes." "Crosshatch. 4 lines." "Yes." "Why mark it at all?" "So I would know which one it was. So I wouldn't mix it up when I was loading the baskets." She paused. "I assumed no one else would look at the base of a loaf of bread." "Most people don't," he said. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. "I look at everything." "I see that," she said. They were quiet for a moment. She waited. "Why didn't you tell your wolves?" she asked. "During the feast. Or after?" He set the cup down. "I sat at the head of that table," he said, "and I reached into the bread basket and chose a loaf and ate it without hesitation, in front of every senior wolf in my command. The message that axe sent was deliberate and specific. It told every wolf in that hall that the Alpha King judged the village's food to be unquestionably safe, that there was no question of threat, that the integration was proceeding on clean terms." He paused. "There are members of this pack who would use any evidence of resistance from a village as grounds for a harder approach to the territory. I do not want a harder approach. A harder approach costs both sides things they cannot afford." "So you ate the bread to protect your interests," she said. "Yes. And yours. At the same time." He looked at her steadily. "These are not always separate things." She sat with this. She was aware that she was being given an accounting of a decision rather than a performance of one, and the difference mattered. "The 3 packs," she said. "My father mentioned them. 3 packs that had known about the water supply." "Yes. What would the other 2 have done with us?" He was quiet for a brief moment, and she understood the quiet as the moment of choosing how much to say, rather than what to say, because she had the sense already that what he said accurately. 2 of them would have relocated the population," he said. "Moved you to whatever peripheral territory was available and unused. The 3rd, he stopped. Then, the 3rd pack's history with civilian populations it has taken from territory it intends to use for itself is not a history of relocation." She absorbed this. She had already understood it from the way her father had not finished the sentence on that first morning, from the shape of what Kalen had just not said. She let herself understand it fully now, clearly, without softening. So we were going to be taken regardless, she said. The water supply was known. 3 different packs were moving toward it. You moved first. I chose to move first, he said, with the specific information I had about what the alternatives were. She looked at him across the table. She thought about what it meant to be told the truth by a person who had just discovered she had tried to harm him and his people. She thought about what kind of person chose that response. You're free to go, he said, not as dismissal, as a statement of what was true. She stood. She had her shawl in her hands. I will remember this, he said. So will I, she said. She went out into the dark of the corridor, through the inn's ground floor, across the cold square, home. She locked the door behind her. She sat at the kitchen table and pressed her palms flat on the wood and breathed slowly until the shaking in her hands stopped. Something had happened in that room that she did not have a name for yet. She would need time. She was good at taking the time that things required. She went to bed, and for the first time in 4 days, she slept without difficulty. 2 weeks after the feast, Mara had a routine she had not planned. 3 mornings a week she crossed the square to the village hall and sat in the side room and was consulted, specifically, by the Alpha King of the Black Fang Pack, on matters concerning Ashvale and the surrounding valley. These consultations had not been formally arranged. They had assembled themselves out of the particular logic of practical necessity, beginning when Dorian came to her door 2 days after the feast with a question about the South Field's drainage patterns and whether the current arrangement would affect the water supply quality when the seasonal dieback began. She had answered him. He had come back the following day with another question, about which families in the village would need additional winter provision, and what forms that provision should take. By the end of the first week, she was going to the hall without being sent for, because 3 mornings a week of direct access to the decisions being made was more useful than waiting at home for Dorian to relay questions. The central fact was that Kaylin listened when she spoke. She came back to this observation daily, turned it over, tested it against specific instances. It was not the listening of someone who was performing engagement while already knowing what they were going to do. It was the listening of someone who was genuinely taking in what they were hearing and allowing it to affect what they thought. He pushed back when he disagreed, specifically and with reasoning she could evaluate. He was right about roughly half of what he pushed back on. When he was wrong, he revised without the particular resistance that she associated with people who had attached their ego to their first position. This was, in Mara's considered experience of people making decisions, the behavior of an unusually rare kind of person. She did not tell the village what she was doing in the hall. She told her father only that she was serving in an advisory capacity, which was true and significantly incomplete. She told Lena nothing beyond that she was busy. She told Clara nothing. She was not hiding it exactly, but she did not yet know what it was, and she had a deep professional resistance to naming things she didn't understand yet, because naming was a form of definition, and definition, before understanding, was one of the most reliable ways she knew to get something wrong. Sarah found out on the 8th day. She appeared at Mara's door with the measuring expression that Mara was beginning to understand was not coldness, but the default mode of someone who had been in many difficult situations and had learned to read them very quickly. She asked if she could come in. Mara said yes, and made tea, without asking whether Sarah wanted any, because it was a reasonable assumption, and set 2 cups on the table. Sarah sat. She looked at the tea. She looked at Mara. I want to understand what you are doing, she said. Answering questions that he asks me, Mara said. Questions about the village, about the valley, the resources, the people who will need extra provision through the winter, the management decisions that affect the village households, things I know that he doesn't. Sarah nodded. And what you get in return. Access to the decisions that affect my village, Mara said. When I think a decision is wrong, I say so. And when you do. Sometimes he changes it. Sometimes he doesn't. When he doesn't, he explains why. Sarah was quiet for a moment. She looked at her tea. He trusts very few people, she said at last. When he does trust someone, he trusts them completely. It is one of his most effective qualities, and one of his most significant vulnerabilities. You're warning me, Mara said. I'm informing you. There is a difference. Sarah picked up her cup and drank from it, which Mara noted as a small signal. The people closest to him become targets, not from within the pack, in most cases. From outside. From the packs and interests who want to understand his thinking, or who want to undermine his decision-making by compromising the sources he relies on. Mara looked at her steadily. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are more useful to this territory than most of the alternatives," Sarah said, "and because he does not always see what is happening around him when something has his full attention." She said the last sentence with the particular care of someone who had chosen to say something significant and was aware they were choosing it. Then she put the cup down, stood, and said she had what she came for and would see herself out. Mara sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the door closed. She turned over what Sarah had said and what she had not said, and the specific shape of the sentence she had stopped in the middle of. She put it in the part of her mind where she kept things she did not yet have enough context to interpret, but wanted to have available when she did. Lena raised the subject 4 days later, on a Thursday evening when they were eating dinner together, with the directness that was her most characteristic quality, and the one Mara sometimes found most demanding. "He watches you," Lena said. No preamble. Mara was looking at her soup. "He watches everything. He is the Alpha King." "Not like that." Lena set her spoon down. "I have been in the square every morning for 2 weeks. I have been paying attention. When you cross the square to go to the hall, he notices you in a way that is different from the way he notices the well, or the oak tree." "You are reading a great deal into someone noticing movement," Mara said. "I'm reading what is there," Lena said. "He watches you the way a person watches something they are trying to understand, and have not finished understanding yet." She paused. "Which is exactly how you watch things." Mara looked at her sister across the table. Lena looked back with the flat calm of someone who knew what she had observed, and had no particular interest in softening it. "You are 16, Mara said. "Yes. And I notice things. You have spent my entire life teaching me to notice things." Lena picked up her spoon again. "You're not going to tell me I'm wrong." Mara went back to her soup. She did not tell Lena she was wrong, because Lena was not wrong. She was not ready to discuss what Lena was right about, which was a different thing. What she turned over in the evenings, in the cellar while she worked on preparations that required her hands and freed her mind, was the file she had been quietly building since the morning after the feast. The things she had noted, the way he listened, and not just listened but incorporated what she said into his thinking in visible ways, the way he had explained his reasoning, fully and honestly, in the inn on the night she expected the worst, the way he had sent Dorian to her with questions that were not administrative in the way she might have expected but were genuine, questions about people, about the specific texture of life in this valley, about things that mattered to the people who lived here, rather than things that mattered to someone who was managing them from the outside. She was building toward something. She could feel it in the way she felt weather coming, with the part of her that recognized shifts before they were visible. She was patient. Patience was her best quality, she thought. She would understand it when she had enough. There was an incident in the middle of the second week that added something important to the file. A pack wolf named Gareth, mid-rank, stationed near the lower field, made a decision about a piece of equipment on the Halkett family's land, redirecting it for pack use, without asking, and without authorization, from anyone with the authority to give it. Young Owen Halkett came to Mara's door in the late afternoon, 17 years old and furious in the clean, unambiguous way of young people who had encountered something unfair for the first time, and were discovering that injustice produced a specific kind of heat. She told him to go home. Then she went to the hall and found Dorian, and told him what had happened, clearly and specifically, what the equipment was, whose it was, what decision had been made, and who had made it. She did not make a speech about it. She stated the facts. Dorian said he would bring it to the Alpha King. The following morning, Dorian came to her door to tell her the equipment had been returned, the situation had been corrected, and the pack wolf in question had been reminded in specific terms of the limits of his authority in the village. He said it in the brisk, factual way of someone reporting a decision that had been straightforward to make. She thanked him and closed the door. She stood in her kitchen and thought about the speed of it. No negotiation. No need for her to argue a case. No moment where someone had to be convinced that the Halkett family's equipment was the Halkett family's to use. She had stated a fact, clearly, to the right person, and the fact had been acted on. The mechanism between report and correction had been so direct and so quick that it told her something specific about how decisions moved in this command structure, and about the quality of what sat at its center. She filed this with the others. The file was considerable now. She was getting close to understanding what all of it added up to. She was not quite ready yet, because she wanted to be sure she was interpreting the data accurately, and not simply finding the interpretation she preferred. This was the most important discipline in her professional life, the willingness to keep gathering until you were certain, even when you had already formed a hypothesis you liked. She kept gathering. But she noted honestly, looking forward to the morning she crossed the square. She was aware of this in the same precise way she was aware of everything that was relevant. She filed it alongside the rest, in the patient, careful part of herself that kept things she was not yet ready to say, but was almost ready to know. 3 weeks after the feast, in the third meeting of that week, Mara told Kalen that his proposed approach to the eastern field's winter drainage would destroy the Halkett family's root cellar by spring thaw, and she showed him precisely why, using the field survey she had walked the previous afternoon, and the measurements she had taken with the wooden rule she kept in the tool shed. He looked at her measurements. He looked at the survey. He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way that meant he was actually working through the problem, rather than deciding how to respond to it. "You walked the whole field," he said. "I walked the whole field," she agreed. "Yesterday." It seemed easier than arguing from memory. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she had begun to learn was as close as he came to humor in a formal setting, which was a very slight compression of something at the corner of his mouth, that came and went quickly enough that you could miss it if you were not paying attention. She had been paying attention. "The eastern drainage needs to change direction," he said. "Yes. I have a suggestion, if you want it." "I want it." She told him the alternative. He asked 2 specific questions. She answered them. He made the notation on his working document that indicated he was adopting the change. This was how the mornings in the hall went. They had settled into a pattern that she found, honestly and without trying to qualify it, effective, and occasionally more than that. He brought the decisions that were forming, and she brought the knowledge that lived in the village and its land, and between those 2 things they produced outcomes that were consistently better than what either of them would have produced separately. She knew this. She believed he knew it too. What she had stopped trying to pretend, at least to herself, was that the effectiveness was the only reason she came. She walked home on Thursday afternoon of the 3rd week, and found Sarah sitting on the low stone wall outside her door. This had not happened before. Sarah did not generally appear in places without having sent word ahead. Mara stopped in front of her and waited. Sarah looked at her with the measuring look, which had softened slightly over the past 3 weeks into something that still measured, but also held what it found. "I want to ask you something," she said, directly. "Go ahead," Mara said. "What is it that you want from these meetings?" Mara looked at her. It was a genuine question, she could tell, not a challenge. Sarah was asking it because she wanted to understand something, and Sarah only asked questions she genuinely wanted the answers to. "Access to the decisions that affect my village," Mara said. This was the answer she had given before, and it was still accurate. "Is that all?" Sarah said. Mara looked at her steadily. Sarah said, "I am not asking to cause difficulty. I am asking because I watch him in those meetings, and something has changed from the early weeks. The way he thinks through the decisions has changed. He is." She paused, choosing. "More careful, more specific. He asks different questions than he used to ask." "That seems like a good thing," Mara said. "It is," Sarah said. "I am noting it." She stood. "I am also noting that you are careful about what you tell him. That you tell him the truth about what will work and what won't, and you tell him when he is wrong, and you do not manage him." "Why would I manage him?" Mara said. "People manage powerful people all the time," Sarah said. "They tell them what they want to hear. They give them the version of information that serves the teller." She looked at Mara directly. "You don't do that." "It would be a waste of his time and mine," Mara said. "Yes," Sarah said. "It would." She stepped off the wall. "I wanted to tell you that I see that, and that it matters." She paused. "For the territory." She walked away across the square without looking back. Mara stood on her doorstep for a moment, watching her go. Then she went inside, hung up her coat, and made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the cup, and she thought about what Sarah had said and what she had not said, which was the same careful shape it had always been. a sentence that stopped before it reached its own conclusion. She thought about Lena's observation. She thought about the specific quality of Kaylin's attention in the meetings, which she had been trying to characterize accurately for 3 weeks, and had not yet found the right word for, because the available words, engaged, focused, intent, were all true, and all insufficient. She thought about the fact that she was still gathering. She was good at gathering. She was less certain she was ready for what she would have to acknowledge when she stopped. Lena came in from the street and sat at the table, and looked at her sister with the particular expression that meant she had been thinking about something for a while. "He was watching you this morning again," she said, "when you left the hall." "Lena," Mara said. "I am not going to stop mentioning it," Lena said pleasantly. "I think you already know, and I think you should finish knowing it." Mara looked at her sister. 16 years old, dark-haired, with their mother's way of saying the most accurate thing in the simplest available words. "What does finish knowing mean?" Mara said. "It means you've been gathering information for 3 weeks, Lena said. "And at some point, gathering information is what you do, instead of admitting what you already know." She stood and went to the kitchen to start the evening meal, and Mara sat at the table and looked at the window, and thought about the particular kind of honesty that other people could see before you were ready to see it yourself. That night she went to the cellar and worked for 2 hours on the preparations that had been waiting, and she thought about what Lena had said, and she thought about what Sarah had said, and she thought about the meetings in the hall and the specific quality of the look Kaylin gave her when she told him he was wrong about something, which was a look she had no good word for but which she recognized. She cleaned the empty jar that had held the wolfsbane powder. She set it back on its cleared shelf in the corner. She looked at it for a moment. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed. She was almost ready. She would know when she was ready, because the thought of saying it aloud would stop feeling like too much. She admitted to herself in the dark before sleep, getting very close to the point where it no longer felt like too much. The Ironmore Pack's delegation arrived 4 days later, on a gray morning. She heard about it from Nell before she had finished her first cup of tea, because Nell's window gave the best view of the northern road in the village, and Nell had decided, somewhere in the past several weeks, that maintaining this view was a community service. Nell's granddaughter came to Mara's door at 8:30 with the information that 6 riders had come down from the pass, under a banner that Nell didn't recognize, and that they were at the inn now. Mara looked up the Ironmore banner in the reference books she kept on the hall shelf. She stood with the book open for a moment, after she confirmed what she had suspected, and then she closed it, and stood at the kitchen window, and thought about what brought a pack that had been outmaneuvered to the doorstep of the pack that had outmaneuvered them, and what they were likely to have come for. Dorian came to her door at midday to ask if she could bring refreshments to the hall's side room during the afternoon meeting. She was the village's head cook of record. Refreshments fell to her. She said she would bring them, and she did not ask questions, because she was not supposed to have questions about this, as far as Dorian was aware. She arrived at the hall at the time he specified, with the tray, and let herself in through the side entrance. The narrow corridor that ran the hall's length was quiet. At the far end, the secondary door, the one that accessed the main hall's side alcove, currently used as a waiting room for the meeting, stood not quite latched, the gap at the door's edge perhaps 1.5 inches. She heard voices through it. She stopped. The voice she was hearing was not Kaylin's. It was controlled, careful, the voice of someone who had prepared what they were saying, and was delivering it with the particular precision of a prepared position. She heard concern for the welfare of the civilian population. She heard reference to reports of significant distress among the residents of the occupied settlement. She heard the word humanitarian used twice in the way that people used it when they needed a word that couldn't easily be argued against. Then she heard the spokesman say, with the specific casual ease of someone introducing a known fact, that the information they had received about conditions in Ashvale had come from inside the village itself, that a source within the settlement had been providing reliable reports for the past 3 weeks, that these reports indicated a level of civilian suffering that the Ironmore Pack felt, in good conscience, it could not simply ignore. Mara stood in the corridor without moving. 3 weeks. From the first days of the occupation, someone in this village, someone she knew, had been sending information to the Ironmore Pack. Not general information, specific reports, detailed enough and regular enough to have been useful to a pack that was building a formal basis for interference. She heard Kaylin's voice respond, brief, controlled, unmoved. He thanked the delegation for bringing their concerns to his attention. He stated that the territory was stable and its population well maintained. He moved the conversation, smoothly and without apparent effort, to the topic of formal border arrangements and interpack protocol. The Ironmore spokesman followed him there because Kaylin's tone had made it very clear that the previous line of conversation was closed, without ever saying so in words that could be quoted later. She stood in the corridor for another full minute after the conversation moved on, making sure she had heard everything correctly, making sure she had the significant pieces in their correct order. The informant was inside the village. 3 weeks of communication. The Ironmore pack using this to build a formal case for interfering in a territory they had not been able to acquire by arriving first. She thought about the third pack, the one that did not maintain the civilian populations of territories it took for itself. She set the tray down against the corridor wall and walked out. She crossed the square at something close to a controlled walk, went into the inn through the main entrance, and told the wolf at the door that she needed Dorian immediately. She was inside the building in 2 minutes and Dorian appeared in 3, which was faster than she had expected, and told her he had not been far. She told him what she had heard. She told him all of it, in the precise order she had heard it, without interpretation, just the specific words and the specific information they contained. Dorian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "You came here directly," he said. "Yes." "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because someone inside this village is giving information to a pack that my father told me, on the first morning after your arrival, does not maintain the civilian populations of territories it takes for itself. That information is being used to build a formal basis for interference in this territory. If the interference is successful, the situation here changes in a direction that is not good for anyone who actually lives here. I am protecting my people. That is what I am doing." Dorian nodded once, the nod of someone who had received the answer they needed and knew what to do with it. He said he would inform the Alpha King immediately and left the room. She went back through the inn's ground floor, out through the main entrance, across the square, and in through the hall's side entrance. She picked up the tray from where she had set it against the corridor wall. She delivered the refreshments to the kitchen area, set them out on the secondary serving table, and went home. She spent the afternoon on Nell's joint compresses. She kept her hands busy and her attention on the work in front of her, and she did not let herself run ahead to the Ironmore meeting, or what Dorian was telling Kaylin right now, or what was going to happen next. She worked through the preparation in the way she always worked through difficult things, one step at a time, fully present to the immediate task. She heard the Ironmore delegation depart in the late afternoon, from the window of the room where she was working. She did not go to the window to watch. She could tell everything she needed to from the sound of it, the absence of extended courtesies, the brevity, the particular quality of a meeting that had concluded without the initiating party receiving what they had come for. She sealed the last compress and set it in the delivery basket for Nell. Then she sat in the quiet of the back room and waited to see what came next. Dorian came to her door at 7 the following morning and asked if she would come to the hall. She put on her coat and went. The hall was quieter than it usually was at this hour. The morning light came through the windows in the particular pale, clear way of late autumn mornings after a cold night, and the long tables were empty. Kaylin was at the working table in the side room when Dorian brought her through, with a map open in front of him and 2 documents set beside it, and he looked up when she came in. He was very focused this morning. She could see it in the set of his face, the quality of stillness that he had when he was working through something significant. He was not unsettled. She was not sure unsettled was within his range, or if it was, she had not yet seen it. But he was more concentrated than usual, the way a lens was more concentrated when the light source was brighter. He said, "Sit down," and she sat. "The informant has been identified," he said. He told her who it was. It was not someone she would have guessed, which she supposed was the point. The most effective informants were never the people you would have guessed. He told her how it had been handled. Quietly, without public disclosure. The person in question was still in the village, would remain in the village, but the communication had been ended and would not resume. He said all of this matter-of-factly, in the same tone he used for territorial management decisions, and she could see that he had thought through the handling carefully, that he had chosen the approach that caused the least damage to the village's internal coherence. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, when he finished. He looked at her across the table. The morning light was very clear between them. "Because you came to me yesterday when you had no obligation to," he said. "You owed me nothing. The practical outcome you wanted, the territory's stability, is something you could have argued serves your own interests as much as mine, so you can tell yourself you did it for your own reasons if that sits better. But that is not why you came." She looked at him steadily. "What do you think is why I came?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "And you do the right thing. Even when it is inconvenient. Even when it complicates the position you are trying to maintain." She sat with this. "And," he said. She waited. "And because I think you have stopped thinking of this as entirely opposition," he said. He said it without drama, in the same even way he said everything. "I think you are still working out what to think of it as instead. But the opposition is no longer the whole picture." Mara looked at him. He looked back. The morning was very quiet around them. "You're giving me information I didn't ask for," she said. "Yes. About your own conclusions." "Yes. Why?" He picked up the cup beside the map and looked at it for a moment before he answered. "Because I find that I want you to know things accurately," he said. "Even when those things are conclusions I have reached about you. You deserve accurate information, and I—" He stopped briefly, and she recognized the pause, the specific kind that meant he was choosing words with more than usual care. "I am not in the habit of explaining my thinking to people, but I find I want to explain it to you." The morning held them both in its clear autumn light. Outside, the square was beginning to fill with its usual morning sounds, the village moving through the beginning of another day. "The Ironmore pack came here expecting to find a lever," she said. "Yes?" "They found one. Someone in this village had been giving them exactly what they needed to argue for intervention." She paused. "You handled it without causing more damage than was already done." "Yes. That was the right decision." She met his eyes. "I want you to know that I think it was the right decision. Not because you need me to say it, because it was true, and it seemed worth saying." He looked at her for a moment, with the particular full quality of his attention, the kind that was not evaluating, and not performing, and not calculating, just simply present and real. "Thank you," he said, not reflexively, as a genuine acknowledgement. She nodded. She picked up her papers, the ones she had brought for the meeting that had been displaced by the morning's more immediate conversation, and she set them back in her bag. "The Eastern Field Drainage Revision," she said, standing. "Should we address that this morning, or next session?" "Next session," he said. "Come Thursday." She went home across the bright, cold square, and she stood at the kitchen window for a long time after she took off her coat, looking out at the familiar shapes of the village, the houses, and the well, and the oak tree, and the hall with the pack's presence settled into it, like weather that had come and decided to stay. Something had changed in the past 24 hours. She was honest enough with herself to know it, and precise enough to know she didn't yet have the right words for what it was. She thought about what Lena had said, about finishing what you knew. She thought about Sarah's stopped sentence. She thought about the way Kaylin had said, "I find I want to explain it to you." Not as a confession, but as a statement of observation, the same tone he used for facts about drainage patterns and winter provisions. She made tea. She sat at the table. She thought about what it meant, that the thing she needed to do most right now was go back to the hall on Thursday, and about how clearly she was looking forward to that. She thought about this for a while, without trying to call it something it wasn't yet. Then she picked up her pen and started drafting the modification proposal for the Eastern Field that would be ready by Thursday morning, because whether or not she was ready to name what was happening, the work was still there, and the work did not wait for her to figure herself out. She worked through the afternoon, and the proposal came together well, and she set it aside when the light went, and made dinner, and ate it with Lena, who did not mention the hall or the meetings or anything, except whether Mara thought it was going to snow before the weekend, and Mara said she thought it probably would, and they cleaned up together in the ordinary quiet of a household that was figuring out, in its particular way, what the new shape of ordinary looked like. It was not the same as before. Mara had stopped expecting it to be. Before was before, and before had ended the night the ground shook, and she had set down her pestle and gone to the window. What was here now was not worse than before, she had decided, though it was different. It was more complicated. It required more of her. It had given her, in the complicated way that things gave you things, a purpose, and a place in something larger than the cellar and the village rounds. And she was not sure she would have chosen that, given the choice. But she had not had the choice. She had had the night, and the square full of wolves, and her own name on the bottom of a notice. She had had what was available. She thought about this. She thought about what you did with what was available, when what was available was not what you would have chosen. She thought about the mortar and the pestle and the locked box, and the decision she had made with them, and the distance between the decision and the outcome, and what had grown in that distance. She went to bed when the fire burned low, and she thought about Thursday morning, and she fell asleep thinking about it, which was the most honest indication she had yet had of where she actually was. He found her in the herb garden behind the inn on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after the Ironmore delegation left. She had been tending the garden since the end of the first week of the occupation, because the pack's arrival had disrupted the fall maintenance, and several things in it were going to die before winter, if no one intervened. She had not asked permission. No one had told her she could use it, and no one had told her she couldn't, and she had proceeded on the principle that useful work was its own justification, until someone corrected her. It was a gray morning, overcast and cold, but not unpleasantly so, the kind of autumn morning that had a quality of clarity to it under the cloud cover, the air very clean, the light flat and even. She was working in the bed between the sage and the winter savory, clearing the dead growth from the season's end, and turning the soil where frost had compacted it. The physical work had the particular quality she relied on when she needed to think without forcing the thinking, her hands occupied, her mind free to move where it needed. She heard his footsteps on the garden path and recognized them before she turned around. She had not meant to learn the sound of his step. She had simply spent enough weeks in spaces where he also was to have learned it the way you learned anything you were exposed to consistently, without trying. She finished what she was doing with the sage, the specific action she had been in the middle of, and then she turned. He was standing at the garden's edge with his hands at his sides. She had never seen him arrive anywhere without something in his hands. He always had a document or a cup or his gloves. Without these objects he looked different in a way she had a hard time articulating. Not smaller, not less, but more like a person and less like a function. He was simply standing at the edge of her garden in the gray morning, and his hands were at his sides, and he looked like someone who had come to a specific place for a specific reason, and had not yet decided how to begin. She looked at him. She waited. "The Ironmore situation is fully resolved," he said. "I know," she said. "You told me." He nodded. He looked at the garden, at the beds she had been working through, at the places where the soil had been turned, and the places where she had still to go. He was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from his usual silences, which were the silences of deliberate and efficient people who spoke when they had something to say, and did not fill space otherwise. This was a different kind of quiet, the kind that came before something. "There is something I want to tell you," he said. He was still looking at the garden. "About the bread." She waited. "I told you the political reason I ate the marked loaf," he said. "The reason about managing my wolves, and maintaining a clean integration. That reason was true." "I know it was," she said. "There was another reason." He looked at her then, directly, with the full quality of attention she had been learning for the past several weeks. "Before I reached into that basket, I looked across the hall, and I found you. You were at the far end, with the water pitcher, and I thought about who you were, the woman who came outside on the night we arrived when every other person stayed behind closed doors, who was named as head cook and used it, who had spent 2 days and at least one whole night making a plan and carrying it through. And I thought, the instinct is correct. The thing she is trying to do is correct." He paused. "And I did not want you to be harmed for acting on a correct instinct, even when the method was wrong." Mara sat back on her heels and looked at him. "You could have told me this, the night you summoned me," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because telling you that night would have felt like making a claim on something I had not established any right to. We were strangers. You had just tried to poison me. It was not—" he paused. "It was not the right moment. And now it is," she said. "I think now it is," he said. "Because you have sat across that table from me 3 mornings a week for nearly a month, and you have told me when I was wrong, without managing the information first. And you have walked across the square to that hall on mornings when I know it cost you something, and you came directly to Dorian when you heard the Ironmore informant named, without stopping to calculate what it would cost you to do it. He looked at her. I know what all of that means. I want you to know that I know. She looked at him, in the gray morning light. The garden was very quiet around them. The smell of turned soil and winter herbs, and the cold particular smell of the overcast sky above the mountains. I came to Dorian, she said, because it was the right thing, and because... She stopped. She started again. Because by that point, I had stopped thinking of this as something I could or should undermine. Not because I had chosen to accept it exactly. Because I had been watching what was happening, and I had made a conclusion about it, and the conclusion changed what the right thing to do was. What was the conclusion? He said. She looked at him steadily. That you are trying to build something that is actually better than what the alternatives were, she said. Not good in the way that good looks in a world with no constraints. Better in the specific, real sense of, given what was available, given what was actually possible, you are making the decisions that produce the best outcome for the most people, including mine. She paused. I don't say this easily. I have been arguing with myself about it for weeks. I know, he said. I have been watching you argue with yourself. She looked at him for a moment, and something in the precise quality of that observation, something in the frankness of his saying it, made her laugh. A small sound, mostly exhaled, but genuine. How long have you known? Since the second week, he said. Since the meeting where you told me the Northfield rotation was wrong, and then spent the rest of the morning finding reasons to stay in the hall. She had not been aware she had done that. She added this to her list of things she had done without knowing she was doing them, which had apparently been longer than she realized. What you said just now, he said, about building something better. That is the clearest statement anyone has given me of what I have been trying to do. He paused. I have had people around me who understand the mechanics of it. I have not had someone who could name what it is for. She looked at him. What is it for? She said. It was not quite a question. For exactly what you named, he said. For the people who are in the territories. For the ones who were going to be taken regardless of what I did, because the resources were known and the packs were moving. He looked at her with the directness that was simply his way of looking at everything, but had come to feel specific and deliberate in the way it landed on her. I arrived first, so that I would be the one making the decisions about how it went. Every decision I have made in 4 years has been built on that. She thought about this. She thought about the night the wolves came, the sound of paws on the earth and the long columns, and the way the square had filled. She thought about standing on her step and counting, until the counting was no longer useful. I was so afraid, she said. Not to him exactly. More simply stating a fact that deserved to be said. That first night, I stood on the step, and I was afraid in a way I had not been before. I know, he said. I saw it. She looked at him quickly. Not in the way you might think, he said. You were the only person who came outside. You were afraid, and you came outside anyway. I saw the fear, and I saw the decision to stand there regardless, and those two things together are what told me what kind of person you were. He paused. I did not forget it. The garden was very quiet. She was on her knees in the soil, and he was standing at the garden's edge, and between them was everything that had been said in the past few minutes, and everything that had not been said in the past few weeks. All of it present, all of it sitting in the gray morning air. I tried to poison you, she said. I want to be clear that I did that. I know. The fact that it didn't work doesn't change what I did. I know that too, he said. I don't want to pretend it was something else. You made a plan to make my wolves sick enough to give your village time to run. It was an honest plan, made for the right reasons, with the information you had. He looked at her. The information was incomplete. The plan failed, and then something else happened instead. He paused. I find I am glad something else happened instead. She looked at him for a long moment. So am I, she said, and she meant it simply and completely, without qualifying it, which was itself a kind of answer to everything she had been gathering and testing and patiently filing for the past 4 weeks. She went back to the winter savory at the far end of the bed, because there was still work to do, and her knees were already cold, and staying in one place too long had never been her natural mode. He stayed at the garden's edge for a while longer, and they talked about things that were not the territory, or the management questions. The smaller things that come out when the significant things have been said and there is room for something less structured. He told her he had not slept well in new places for as long as he could remember, which was a significant practical difficulty in a life that was made almost entirely of new places. And he described it with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone who had long since accepted his own particular limitations and was not embarrassed by them. She told him she had never been east of the valley, not once, not in 23 years, and watched something move across his face that she interpreted correctly as genuine surprise failing to disguise itself entirely. "You have been here your entire life," he said. "Yes. And you never wanted to leave." She thought about this. "I wanted to learn everything there was to know about this place," she said. "It seemed like more than enough." He looked at her for a moment, and the expression that settled on his face was not amusement exactly, but something that included amusement inside something larger, something that looked like understanding, and like regard in equal measure. When he finally turned to go, back across the garden path and toward the inn, she stayed among the winter savory and watched him leave. She stayed there for a while after he disappeared through the inn's side door, her hands still in the soil, the gray sky above her, the garden winter quiet around her. She had enough information now. She had been gathering carefully and honestly for weeks, and she had enough. She was not ready to say it aloud yet. She was close enough to ready that she knew it would not be long. She finished the winter savory, cleaned her tools, and went home. 3 months after the night the wolves came, Mara crossed the village square on a cold, clear morning, with papers in her bag, and the particular quality of focus she brought to mornings that had real work in them. The square was not the same as it had been 3 months ago. She had stopped expecting it to be. It had the pack's presence woven into it in ways that had settled from disruption into something else. Not normal in the old sense, but present and functional in its own sense. A changed baseline that she moved through now, with the same ease she had once moved through the unchanged one. The wolf guards at the hall entrance were part of the morning. The sound of the supply wagons coming in through the northern road 3 mornings a week was part of the morning. The particular way Dorian walked across the square toward the inn at the same time each day had become as familiar as the way old Finn walked his dogs, which told her something about how thoroughly the past 3 months had reorganized the landscape of ordinary things. She had a desk in the hall. She still found this occasionally remarkable. It was a plain desk in the side room, with a chair and a shelf for papers, and she sat at it 3 mornings a week and managed the communication between Ashvale's households and the pack's administrative structure. This communication was more substantial than she had expected. The gap between the village's practical reality and the pack's formal processes turned out to be wide enough to require a full-time bridge, and she was the bridge. She had 2 people helping her now. Young Owen Halkett, who had come to her door angry about the Gareth situation, and who had turned out to have a precise and reliable gift for the formal side of administrative work, and Clara's older daughter, who could read a situation and decide whether it needed escalation faster than most people twice her age. Civil Liaison. That was the title the village used. She had read the formal document establishing it twice before she signed it, because she did not sign things she had not read. The morning meeting was about the winter trade route access for the 3 valley settlements that were now under Black Fang territorial authority. The meetings had been working through a negotiation of terms for the past 2 weeks, and today she was bringing the revised version of a figure she had told Kaylin last Thursday needed to change. She had spent Wednesday evening reworking the calculation, and she was confident in the new number. Sarah was at the small table outside the side room when she came through the door, reviewing something with the focused quiet that was characteristic of how Sarah did everything. She looked up. "The seasonal breakdown," she said. "He'll want it today." "I brought it," Mara said. "The alternative timeline for the distribution adjustment. Also brought." Mara pulled her coat off. "You are very thorough in the morning." Sarah looked at her with the expression that had once meant pure assessment and now meant something warmer, though not warm in any conventional sense. It meant something more like, "I have reached a conclusion about you, and it is a good one, and I am not going to say this in any way you can easily repeat." "So are you," she said, and went back to her document. This was how things were with Sarah now. Efficient, dry, informative in the specific ways that mattered. She gave Mara information she needed before she had to ask for it, which was Sarah's form of investment, and Mara had learned to recognize it as such. Lena was at the field medical unit this morning. She had been there since the third week of the occupation, first as an observer and then, with a speed that had surprised everyone except Mara, as a working member with real responsibilities. Dorian had told Mara 3 weeks ago that Lena had the kind of instinct for diagnostic work that was not something you could teach, that either was there from the beginning or wasn't. Mara had gone home and told Lena directly. Lena had looked at the floor for a moment and then looked up with the expression she had been developing over the past months, the one that had replaced the wide-eyed fear of the first night and the studied bravery of the first weeks, the one that looked like someone discovering what they were for and finding it larger than they had thought. Owen Voss still ran the village's internal affairs. The pack had not replaced the elder structure, had worked around it and through it, and Mara's role was the point where those two structures met. She had breakfast with her father twice a week, and they talked about the village the way they had always talked about it, practically and precisely, and she could see in him the particular kind of adaptation that happened when a capable person found ways to do meaningful work inside a structure they had not chosen and did not fully endorse. It cost him something. She knew this, and she did not pretend otherwise, but he was there, and he was intact, and so was Ashvale. He had said to her, 2 weeks ago, "Your mother would have found this impossible." She would have also done it, Mara said. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said quietly. She would have. The morning meeting ran 80 minutes. The trade route figures were reviewed, and she presented her revised calculation. He asked 2 questions about it, both of which she had anticipated and had answers for. He made the notation indicating he was adopting the change. The seasonal breakdown was reviewed. The alternative timeline for the distribution adjustment was presented, and he pushed back on the timing, as she had expected. The implementation window doesn't give the logistics enough time, he said. It gives the village households the notice they need, she said. The logistics constraint is on the pack side, and I believe you have the capacity for it with current staffing. He looked at the proposal. He looked at her. You're saying it's manageable. I'm saying it's manageable. If I'm wrong, you can tell me on Thursday. He was quiet for a moment, working through it the way he worked through everything, actually working through it, rather than looking for the reasoning that fit what he had already decided. The alternative timeline, he said. She put it on the table. He read it. He was quiet, in the specific way that meant something was settling into place. This works, he said. I know, she said. He made the notation. The particular movement that was not quite a smile, the one she had first seen in the second meeting and had been seeing with increasing regularity since, passed across his face. When Dorian took the papers out to be copied, the brief ordinary quiet settled between them that had become the characteristic ending note of their meetings. She gathered her papers. He closed the folder on his side of the table. There was a small round of bread on the table between them. It had been there since the meeting's start, part of the refreshments that had been brought in, and largely untouched because they both worked through meetings, rather than eating through them. Plain, round, completely unmarked. She saw it. He saw her see it. She looked up. He was already looking at it, and then at her, and what passed between them in the look that followed was everything the past 3 months had been made of. The night on the step, the cellar and the lamp and the mortar and the pestle, the feast and the basket, and the moment his hand moved through the loaves toward the 6th from the left, the walk across the dark square, and the room at the inn, and the question he had asked that she had answered honestly, the meetings and the drainage surveys, and the mornings she had crossed the square, because she was not going to pretend she didn't want to. The garden and the gray morning and the things neither of them had said explicitly in any of those conversations but that had been present in all of them. All of it, in 3 seconds. He broke the bread. He put half on the table in front of her and kept half for himself, and she looked at her half for a moment, at the plain ordinary surface of it, and then she ate it, and it tasted like bread, and she found that the most unremarkable version of a thing could carry the most weight, when the weight was real. She put her papers in her bag. She stood. The North Settlement proposal, she said, at the door. I'll have it by end of week. I know you will, he said. She went out through the main doors and into the cold, clear morning. She stood on the front step of the village hall for a moment. The square moved through its morning around her. Nell at her window with her morning cup, Clara's children on their way to the schoolhouse, Finn at the square's far edge with 2 of his 3 dogs, the third still apparently too cautious for public spaces, though Mara had checked the animal last week, and found nothing medically wrong, and had concluded it was simply a dog with a particular personality. The morning moved through its own motion, ordinary and present. 3 months ago she had stood in this square in the dark and counted wolves until she made herself stop. She had gone to the cellar and opened the locked box and spent 2 nights grinding something into powder that she had carried, in a small jar in her apron pocket, across the square to a feast, put into bread, and given to a man she had been afraid of. The bread had been wrong. The chemistry had been wrong. The thing she had reached for had failed to do what she intended, which was the kind of failure that could have ended very differently than it had. Instead, it had ended here, at this desk in this hall in this village that was still standing, with people still in it, living their lives in the changed and present reality of what was. With Lena at the medical unit finding out what she was for. With her father still at his work, adapted and intact. With Sarah giving her information she needed before she asked for it, which was Sarah's way of saying something she would never say in words. With Kalen Drav breaking a plain round of bread across a table and putting half in front of her without ceremony, which was his way of saying something too. She had gone into the cellar in the dark, looking for a tool to create disorder. She had found the most dangerous thing on the shelf, and she had used it with the particular conviction of someone who was afraid, and had decided that fear was not a good enough reason not to act. She had been wrong about the chemistry. She had been, in a specific and important sense, lucky. But she thought sometimes that luck was a form of information too, that sometimes the gap between what you reached for and what you actually found was the most significant thing that could happen to you, if you were honest enough to work with what the gap gave you instead of mourning what you had intended. She had intended something simple. She had found something more complicated and more specific and more demanding and more real than anything simple could have been. She picked up her bag and walked home across the morning square, under the cold, clear autumn sky, with the next proposal to write, before the end of the week, and the next meeting on Thursday morning, and the work that was hers to do, in the changed and present shape of the world she was living in. She went inside, hung up her coat, put the kettle on. She opened the trapdoor and went down to the cellar. The empty jar sat on its cleared shelf in the back corner, where she had put it after she cleaned it. She looked at it for a moment in the lamplight, the small plain glass jar that had held the powder she had ground with such careful precision, and carried across a square and put into bread. She had kept it because it was honest, because she did not pretend she had not done what she had done. She turned away from it and moved to the working shelf, where the preparations waiting for her attention were lined up in their jars and their bowls, the ordinary ongoing work of a herbalist who knew her village and the people in it, and what they needed from her. Nell's joint compresses, the new batch of cough preparation for the winter season. The dried bundles that still needed sorting before the cold made the cellar damp enough to damage them. She lit the second lamp and got to work. Outside, above her, the village went about its morning. Through the stone ceiling she could hear the sounds of it, the familiar ones, the ones she had grown up with, and the new ones that had arrived with the occupation and stayed, woven through the familiar until they had become part of the same sound. All of it present, all of it real, all of it hers to tend. She picked up the first bundle and began to sort. The work was good. The work was always good. She had known this her whole life, and she knew it now, with the added weight of having come through something difficult, and found, on the other side, that the work was still here, and she was still capable of it, and the people who needed it were still there to need it. She sorted through the afternoon, and when she climbed back up to the kitchen and put the kettle on again for the evening, she thought about the meeting on Thursday, and about the figure she still needed to refine for the North Settlement proposal, and about all the things that were going to need doing in the coming months in this changed and present world. She thought about the bread on the table, about how ordinary it had looked, about what it had meant, eaten in plain sight without ceremony, in the hall of a village that was still standing. She thought, that is enough. And for Mara Voss, who had always demanded precision and had never in her life settled for less than what was actually true, that was saying a great deal.